I'd like to welcome you to our fifth lecture in our series on the American state in a multipolar world, sponsored by the Center for the Study of Economy and Society at Cornell University. Brett DeBerry, Professor of Asian Studies and Comparative Literature Emerita, and the former director of the Society for the Humanities, will have the honor of introducing today's speaker, Andrew Bacevich.
Thank you. I'd like to extend a virtual welcome from Cornell to Professor Andrew Bacevich, who will present our lecture today. I'm sure that the name of Andrew Bacevich, who has authored or co-authored and co-produced over 20 books, as well as written numerous essays in well-known journals and the press, is familiar to many of you in the audience. He is now the president and co-founder of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. The Quincy Institute is both a research institute and a publisher of the online magazine Responsible Statecraft. Its mission statement commits it to promoting ideas that move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and towards vigorous diplomacy in the pursuit of international peace. In fact, I discovered Andrew Bacevich himself is a very active contributor to this online magazine, publishing 3 essays on issues raised by the war in Ukraine just in the month of March alone. And this is certainly a testimony not only to a concern for responsible statecraft, but his fervor as a public intellectual, and certainly an ever prolific pen. Professor Bacevich is a graduate of West Point, after which he served in the US Army in both Vietnam and Iraq, returning to complete his doctoral degree at Princeton University. He subsequently joined the faculty of Boston University, where he now holds the position of Professor Emeritus of History and International Relations. Across his numerous publications, Andrew Bacevich has been an outspoken critic of expansionism in American conduct of its foreign relations, and has also, with great irony, constantly called attention to the contradictions between American profession of lofty goals and the violence and destruction that has accompanied their implementation in military interventions around the globe. As examples, more specific examples of some of the topics that these wide-ranging publications cover, I'm just going to mention 2. I was lucky enough to teach portions of Professor Bacevich's book, The American Empire, which he published with Harvard University Press in 2002 in a course of the same title, American Empire. I'm taught here at Cornell by the Cornell Forum for Justice and Peace, a faculty and graduate student group opposed to American military actions in Afghanistan and Iraq. Professor Bacevich's book was actually published just before the American invasion of Iraq. Yet tracing continuities in the emergence of post-Cold War foreign policy articulations across the Republican administration of George H. Bush and the Democratic administration of Bill Clinton in the 1990s, his book was extraordinarily prescient of developments that followed the totally surprising event of 9/11, and we found it really illuminating in that sense. Like American Empire, Professor Bacevich's most recent book, After the Apocalypse, which was published in 2021, appeared just before the beginning of the Ukraine war, also rather unexpected. Yet similarly, it traces evolutions in the rhetoric of foreign policy and its implementations that are incredibly pertinent to the current crisis. Professor Bacevich highlights in this case how the waning rhetoric of the war on terror has given way to a new paradigm of national security. And I was thinking that maybe, just judging from the title that he sent to the series months ago, that might be the topic he would elaborate on further today, I'm not sure. But he argues that concern for national security, which is in fact the domestic security of our country bounded by the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, now legitimizes military intervention across a global expanse, in addition to skyrocketing budgets for military buildup. And this is in a departure from what was at least the official Cold War policy of containing designated enemies. Paradoxically, this conception of national security also turns out to be temporally unbounded. And as Professor Bacevich acerbically but chillingly comments, the idea means that simply winning needs no longer be the aim of war. As before in the past throughout American history, in fact, this policy has justified what he calls the pairing of humanitarianism with destruction. And I'll just mention that this was also a theme discussed by Samuel Moyn in the last lecture in this series. In the preface to After the Apocalypse, Professor Bacevich cautions that readers will not find it a dispassionate book. In fact, I have found it is the combination of passion and irony that characterizes Professor Bacevich's style of argumentation. I suspect we'll have an opportunity to see this on display in his lecture, The American State in a Multipolar World, a New Security Paradigm. Please join me in welcoming Professor Andrew Bacevich.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. Thanks for the invitation. I wish I were in Ithaca so we could do this face-to-face, but this is the world that we are in. I know that my charter is to speak for about 50 minutes. I will warn you in advance that I probably won't go that long. I must say that my experience, many years of doing this, is that people do appreciate the chance to, I guess, take some shots and have a certain amount of interaction with the speaker. I was to have given this lecture late last year. That is well before Russia invaded Ukraine. At the present moment, that war is still in progress. And as far as I can tell, the final outcome is uncertain. Notwithstanding that, pundits and more than a few scholars have already reached firm conclusions about the war's significance. Put simply, the Russo-Ukrainian war of 2022 changes everything. So, at least, we are told. By way of example, my breakfast table reading as I was drafting this talk included the following comment by Professor Stephen Kotkin of Princeton. Now, Professor Kotkin is a genuinely distinguished Russia scholar, and he cited the war to emphasize a war that is still ongoing as having utterly demolished, quote, all the nonsense about how the West is decadent, the West is over, the West is in decline, and how it's now a multipolar world. According to Professor Kotkin, all that turned out to be bunk, end of quote. Well, mark me down as unpersuaded. If the international order is not multipolar, then how is it to be described? Surely the post-Cold War claims of American unipolarity haven't stood up. And much of what Professor Kotkin described as nonsense is likely to persist regardless of how the ongoing war in Ukraine ends. In short, it's my conviction that while history does have turning points, 1914, 1945 being examples, this is unlikely to be one of them. The scholar Francis Fukuyama made his reputation identifying one particular turning point. Fukuyama famously described the end of the Cold War as the end of history, with the global triumph of American-style liberal democratic capitalism thereafter foreordained. Well, subsequent events have not treated that hypothesis kindly. Now, Fukuyama writes, quoting, "A Russian defeat will make possible a new birth of freedom." Fukuyama thereby appropriating Abraham Lincoln's famous phrase. And it will, again, continuing the quote, and get us out of our funk about the declining state of global democracy. Thanks to the spirited resistance of the Ukrainians, he writes, the spirit of 1989 will live on. I can't help but be reminded of one of my all-time favorite quotes. Jake Barnes speaking to Lady Brett Ashley at the conclusion of Hemingway's novel, The Sun Also Rises. And Jake turns to Lady Brett and says, yes, isn't it pretty to think so? It is very pretty indeed to think Russia's possible and eminently well-deserved defeat in Ukraine, if it actually occurs. It's very pretty indeed to imagine that a new birth of freedom will follow. But consider this complicating factor. Whenever and however this war ends, the conditions that existed prior to Putin's ill-fated decision to invade will still persist. Granted, I'm assuming that we managed to avoid nuclear weapons use, in which case all bets are off. Furthermore, these pre-existing conditions will carry far greater weight than anything to which a besieged nation that until a few weeks ago, few Americans cared about, Ukraine that is, that it is now being subjected. So for my money, Ukraine changes everything is likely to prove less useful as a basis of analysis than Ukraine won't change all that much. To illustrate the point, let's pretend that I did not fall and break my ribs last fall when I was supposed to come give this lecture in Ithaca. Let's pretend that I was able to deliver this lecture as scheduled. The purpose of my planned lecture was to propose an alternative national security paradigm, a radically different approach to providing for the security and well-being of the American people. And my aim this afternoon is to persuade you that that alternative paradigm continues to have relevance. So here then is what you would have gotten from me late last year. In other words, I am now going to read from the text that I wrote then. Ahem, I would have said, the existing approach to basic US policy dating from the end of the Cold War is no longer germane. Events have exposed our prevailing assumptions about national security as false. That's how I would have begun. Remember, this is late 2021, before the war, and here's how I intended then to continue to make that case. Two such erroneous assumptions in particular stand out. First, post-Cold War ideological expectations, the universal triumph of neoliberalism, globalization, liberal democracy, those expectations have turned out to be illusory. Second, and crucially, when put to the test, so too did US military supremacy. The outcome of the Afghanistan war, now all but forgotten, but remember in the fall of 2021, a very big deal indeed, the outcome of the Afghanistan war is only the latest event that demolishes these assumptions. Democracy did not prevail in Afghanistan, and a 20-year-long US military effort there failed abjectly. Further complicating the problem of devising an alternative approach to policy, that is an alternative to the prevailing post-Cold War thinking, are three facts. First, information technology is having a transformative effect on every aspect of human existence, and the effects are both positive and negative. Now, departing here from my script of last fall, as someone who does not have a smartphone and who doesn't do social media, that's me. I inhabit the camp that sees most of those effects as negative. Back to my talk. Second, the second of the three facts that complicate devising an alternative approach to policy. Second, the global distribution of power is radically changing. With the so-called rise of China, the preeminent, but by no means the sole example of that change. And third, the United States finds itself enmeshed in a massive domestic crisis that may well prove to be open-ended. At a minimum, no end to that crisis is in sight. Consider, for example, the possibility, which cannot be excluded. Consider, for example, the possibility that Donald Trump might be the next president of the United States. Now, nominally, this domestic crisis centers on race, gender, and sexuality. But in my judgment, it actually expresses profound anger at the unfulfilled promises of the so-called American way of life. It is a crisis of culture, with prevailing notions of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness having proven somehow to be inadequate. And that inadequacy finds expression in anger, most notably, but not exclusively, among right-leaning whites who feel increasingly dispossessed by the direction of events in our country. So one essential but not sufficient response to the current crisis, remember we're talking about before Ukraine, one essential but not sufficient response to the current crisis will be to adopt a radically different national security paradigm. The existing paradigm, which emerged at the end of World War II and that lasted throughout the Cold War and beyond, focuses on threats out there and emphasizes amassing and using military power as the essential response to those threats. It is simply a fact that the United States designs its military forces not to defend America, but to project power to faraway places in the Middle East, in East Asia, and in Europe. As a practical matter, what we like to call the homeland is undefended, a point vividly driven home on 9/11. The new paradigm, which I am proposing for your consideration, should prioritize threats that endanger Americans where they live. To me, that's a key phrase, where they live. That is to say, not out there, but back here. What are those threats? Well, they include pandemics, for example, COVID-19, the climate crisis, manifested in fires and flood, drought and hurricanes, massive and pervasive environmental degradation, for example, microplastics in the fish that we get from the store to eat, porous borders that facilitate trafficking in drugs, guns, and human beings, thereby undermining the rule of law, cyber intrusiveness, that is to say, the end of privacy and the emergence of a comprehensive surveillance regime, the erosion of confidence in basic government institutions such as the Congress and the Supreme Court, rampant political dishonesty, which promotes cynicism, you might call this the Fox News effect, and the disuniting of Americans, the disuniting of American society stemming from multiple factors, but above all, from unresolved issues regarding race. A new national security paradigm will not only need to respond to existing and emerging threats, such as those that I just enumerated, but will also have to create space for the country to heal itself and to reunify. Now, the foreign policy establishment's preferred response to the present moment, again, this present moment is back in November, preferred response to the present moment, premised on the return of great power rivalry, is unlikely to work. Among other things, the world of the 1930s and 1940s and of the 1950s and 1960s is gone for good. As an aside, the white, male, and mostly Protestant policy elites of that era, of the 30s and 40s, people like George Marshall, Dean Acheson, George Kennan, and Paul Nitze, by and large, grasped the essential problems facing the United States in the wake of World War II, and by and large, formulated a reasonably enlightened response, which included the promulgation of the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the creation of NATO, and NSC 68. Let me be clear, it was not my argument. This was a perfect response to the conditions that they face, but it was reasonably enlightened. Today, that formula, the one devised at the end of World War II, has not only outlived its usefulness, it has become counterproductive. So while today's policy elite certainly scores higher on a diversity scale, with plenty of women of color and women and people of color in positions of responsibility, I see little reason to expect comparable creativity. That is to say, creativity such as was displayed by the generation of Marshall, Acheson, and Kennan. The problem is not simply that the so-called blob is brain dead, although in many respects I think it is. The problem is it's the fact that the United States is not the nation that it was when in the 20th century it faced off against first right-wing and then left-wing totalitarianism. For evidence, look no further than the outcome of the Afghanistan war, a multi-dimensional failure of epic proportions. The United States spent 20 years attempting to accomplish three objectives. First, create a legitimate and viable Afghan nation state. Second, defeat the Taliban. And third, bring into existence Afghan security forces with the capacity and determination to defend the nation. We failed on all counts, with the Biden administration's mismanaged final drawdown of US troops merely punctuating that failure. My premise is that Afghanistan should serve as a wake-up call. We have had other wake-up calls that we have ignored. The Iraq War, for example, and we can no longer afford to do so. So going forward, a proper approach to national security will recognize that keeping Americans safe where they live must shape basic policy. Another favorite phrase of mine, keeping Americans safe where they live. The point is not, emphatically, not to advocate isolationism, disarmament, or pacifism. Global engagement will continue to be imperative. Rather, the point is to prioritize threats that actually matter in the here and now. The United States will always require adequate military forces to defend US vital interests. But Americans have interests badly in need of attention where military power offers little relevance. So where are the Marshalls, Achesons, and Kennans of the present generation who will replicate the achievement of those who some 70 years ago renewed American statecraft in a time of need? Well, don't look for them in the senior ranks of the Biden administration. So that was the essence of the presentation I had planned to make toward the end of 2021. In terms of foreign policy, note the importance I attributed to the Afghanistan war, which has now, today, amazingly, been largely forgotten. Think about it. The longest war in US history ends in catastrophic failure, and within a matter of months, poof, it has vanished down the memory hole. But consider this question: to what extent have events in Ukraine rendered the analysis contained in that presentation, the presentation that I would have given last November, to what extent have events in Ukraine rendered the analysis contained in that presentation obsolete? Well, opinions may differ, but in my judgment, not at all. The would-be heirs of Marshall, Atchison, and Kennan in the present moment essentially assert that the conditions existing after World War II once again exist today, with the United States called upon to replicate policies created to respond to the perceived Soviet threat, essentially equating Russia today to the Soviet Union of yesteryear and Putin to Stalin. All it takes to demolish such a comparison is one look at the battlefield, which has vividly displayed Russian military incompetence. Ask yourself this: if Russia is hard-pressed to defeat its relatively weak near neighbor, Ukraine, then how much of a military threat does Putin pose to NATO? I think the answer is basically none. Or to put it another way, there's nothing in the Russian threat that Europeans can't handle should Germany, France, and the United Kingdom and their NATO allies choose to do so. For Ukraine, there is no question that Putin poses a real and proximate threat. For the United States, I would argue, Putin merely offers a familiar and convenient threat, an excuse to avoid thinking about far more pressing and dangerous challenges that the nation is facing. Recall Lincoln's summons to embark upon a new birth of freedom. The nation needs one, but embarking upon a new Cold War with Russia, or with China for that matter, won't get us there. The core issue, I have come to believe, centers on that word in the lexicon of American politics that has quasi-sacred connotations, namely freedom. Again, we may disagree, but in practical terms, as used in everyday American parlance, freedom means consumption, choice, and mobility. And the more of each, the better. The seldom acknowledged purpose of US grand strategy since World War II has been to provide Americans with more than their fair share of consumption, choice, and mobility. Or to put it another way, to fend off constraints when it came to enabling Americans to indulge their appetite for these commodities. By and large, American statesmen were able to make good on enabling the American people to make good on these aspirations. Not always, remember the Vietnam War, but more often than not. And yes, white males did benefit more than those who were not white and not male. Today, however, it becomes increasingly clear that this conception of freedom is unsustainable, not to mention morally suspect. So yes, we need a new birth of freedom, which must begin, in my judgment, with radically redefining what freedom should entail, not only in terms of rights and privileges, but also in reference to duties and obligations. The real tragedy of the Russo-Ukrainian war will be if it ends up inhibiting that undertaking. Thank you. I look forward to your questions and comments.
We welcome questions from the audience and a discussion.
Let's begin with the question of, was the Ukraine war avoidable? And I think my answer is yes, it was. There's no question but that the prevailing interpretation of the war's origins is a Manichaean one. That what we have here is a contest that poses good against evil. And therefore, there is an obligation on the part of our country and like-minded countries to oppose evil. I would argue that that's too simplistic, that we cannot understand why this war began without acknowledging the legitimacy of Russian national security interests, and indeed the legitimacy of the Russian argument that Russia can be secure only if it controls a sphere of influence, and a sphere of influence that will necessarily include Ukraine. The United States and its allies refused even to discuss that possibility. The Secretary of State explicitly said the United States doesn't believe in spheres of influence. Of course, that's simply not true. Far closer to the truth is the fact that the United States basically claims a global sphere of influence, or at least a broad one. Consider the response of the United States in 1962 when it discovered that the Soviets were installing offensive weapons in Cuba. That was immediately rejected by the United States because the Soviets were interfering in our sphere of influence, as claimed under the terms of the Monroe Doctrine. So I cannot say, I think no one can say, that the war could have been avoided by acknowledging that Russia does in fact have legitimate security interests that ought to be respected. But I think it is a viable argument that had the United States and its NATO allies been willing at least to consider what those interests consisted of, it might have been possible to avoid this catastrophic conflict.
We have a question related from Gerardo Otero. Once the war began, given NATO's unresponsiveness to Russia's perceived national security interests, could the Biden administration have taken a policy to promote peace rather than escalation?
Once the war began, the Biden administration's alternatives really came down to, I think, three. One is condemn Russian actions as illegal aggression. It's a reasonable argument, and therefore launch a counter-intervention in defense of Ukraine, risking the possibility of World War III. Second possibility, I think, was to follow the course of action they did, to provide material support, try to stiffen the amount of Ukrainian resistance, even though at the time, of course, most informed observers assumed that Ukraine would be quickly overrun. And I guess the third option would have been to stay out of the fight, Washington offering itself as an honest broker, but in all likelihood, a hands-off approach that would have allowed the Russians to achieve their military objectives. So Biden took course of action too. I think given the circumstances that existed once Putin gave the order to intervene, option number two was probably the least bad. Unfortunately, that option has not led to any clear understanding of how to bring this war to an end, which of course is the imperative of the moment.
We have another question from Lisette Blanks. When you say that foreign diplomacy must change for the United States, where should Americans focus, regardless of political views, to help out international relations?
Well, again, I some may say that I am taking too narrow a perspective here, but it is my conviction that our country has sustained so much damage, many explanations or sources, but I think above all, damage caused by our ill-advised military policies of the post-Cold War era, that our number one obligation to our fellow citizens is to create opportunities to repair the damage. And that begins with, I think, avoiding further needless wars, such as those that have caused so much damage over the past 30 or so years. But that's not the question. The question is, well, what should the United States be doing? I personally think that the United States needs to offer itself as an honest broker in regional disputes that pose the greatest danger of instability, rather than choosing sides. That's our inclination. You know, in disputes between Saudi Arabia and Iran, to cite one example, we choose sides. We choose to align ourselves with Saudi Arabia. We choose to classify Iran as an enemy. That's an approach that works well for the military-industrial complex. It does not, in my judgment, work particularly well in trying to bring about the resolution of disputes between other countries. So we've been too quick to pick sides.
Another question from CJ March. Why doesn't Europe pull out of NATO, essentially dissolving it, thereby preventing future conflicts driven by NATO expansion and aggression?
Well, to take the first point of the premise, I do think it is correct to argue that reckless NATO expansion, justified as necessary to provide for European security and to advance European democracy and prosperity, has had grievous unintended consequences. Nonetheless, that's happened. NATO expansion has happened. NATO isn't going to go away. And therefore, the more immediate question, I think, in this regard is, when will Europe assume responsibility for its own security? When will Europe recognize that the world of 1947 is gone for good, and that European nations collectively have the capacity to provide for their own security and ought to do so? So that leads to not an idea of of dissolving NATO, because Europe does need some type of security arrangements, but it leads to the question of whether or not the United States needs to continue to be a member of NATO. And there, I must say, I'm in the camp that says, no, we don't need to. Europe can manage its own affairs. And we have other fish to fry, as it were. You know, from a grand strategic perspective, if we asked ourselves, what is the purpose, the ultimate purpose of US policy? The ultimate purpose of our engagement globally, because we are engaged globally. It seems to me that the ultimate purpose should be to bring about the creation of a community of democratically inclined and self-sufficient nations that can manage their own affairs. And that's Europe. That wasn't Europe in 1947 at the beginning of the Cold War. But it is Europe today. So what the United States should be doing is to declare mission accomplished and to militarily, not entirely, militarily withdraw from Europe, turning our attention to other purposes. You know, the criticism directed against the United States by many people, to include me at certain times, is that American policy has essentially been imperialistic, that America has sought to be a hegemon, that America amasses military power in order to dominate or control. And what I've suggested is a way to rebut that charge is for us to insist upon Europe managing its own affairs so that militarily we can leave and therefore give the lie to the claim that our purposes are hegemonic.
Well, certainly a European security agreement or treaty, which included Russia as a European country, that was pan-European without the United States would be better than what we have. Had it been put in place earlier, it might have prevented this war. But we have another question. Mike Zach asks, who specifically should lead the creation of this new paradigm if there's no one in the Biden administration able to do so? Must we wait until 2024 and hope for a new president up to the task?
Well, sadly, there's nobody on the horizon that I can see that will provide that leadership. You know, it was mentioned that I'm involved in something called the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which is a startup Washington think tank. And our purpose, I think, most broadly stated, our purpose is to try to reinvigorate the discussion of America's role in the world and to call attention to alternative approaches to policy that certainly would have to provide for American security, but also would perhaps provide the breathing space for the sort of domestic reforms that certainly I believe are necessary. So there is an urgent need for debate, dialogue, fresh thinking, which quite frankly, we don't get either from the foreign policy establishment or from those sources of advice, like the established network of think tanks, and frankly, many university-based academic programs. So there is a fundamental need to rethink America's role in the world. Again, without trying to suggest that the post-World War II generation got everything right, because they did not. But I think when we look at that generation, Marshall, Atchison, Kennan, et al., they certainly were willing to support a radical departure from what US policy had been prior to World War II. They were willing to acknowledge the magnitude of change that World War II had caused, and then to realistically assess how the United States would have to adapt. The basic framework of what I'm arguing is that conception of the role that the United States should play in the world, dating from the beginning of the Cold War, that conception is now badly out of date. And we need something that is comprehensively different, and we're not going to get it from the existing foreign policy establishment, which is still wedded to the premises of US policy that date back to the beginning of the Cold War.
We have a question from Gerardo Otero. From a military standpoint, would the Ukraine war have been shorter if the NATO powers had not intervened, that is, at a lower cost in human tragedy in the form of loss of life and displacement?
It's impossible to say. I mean, war is an enterprise fraught with chance and uncertainty. And therefore, it really is impossible to say. I think what we can say, based on the actual unfolding of the war, is that most observers, I would certainly include myself, vastly overstated Russian military capabilities. We assumed that Russia possessed a modern military, a military that not only had an arsenal of high-tech weapons, but that had learned from the lessons of recent wars to have developed techniques, doctrines, capabilities that would enable them to use those weapons effectively. Nothing that we have seen, at least as reported through the sources of information that we get, suggests that the Russians have learned anything like the lessons of how to use modern weapons effectively. So that's been a huge surprise, and I suppose it's also been a surprise that the Ukrainians have not been intimidated, have risen up, have demonstrated enormous bravery, resolve, and determination to defend their country. Very difficult to have predicted any of that in advance of hostilities. Quite frankly, very difficult to predict how things might have gone had the United States and its allies taken a different approach.
We have a question from Peter Katzenstein. Could you elaborate on your view of the National Security Council 68 that is often credited for the full-blown militarization of the US foreign policy after 1950? You seem to view it differently.
Professor Katzenstein has put his finger on precisely the weakest point of the argument that I was making, because I am not a fan of NSC 68, which is a document based on some wildly false premises and fraught with emotional language that almost makes it difficult to read in the present moment. What I would say is that at the moment when NSC 68 was drafted, I think the date on the document, the finished document that was given to President Truman, was April 1950. Crucial because that was before the before the Korean War began. Truman did not sign off on NSC 68 until after the Korean War began. In other words, the outbreak of the war in Korea was the trigger for his implementation of that document. Set aside the language. The document did make the case for a comprehensive program of rearmament. Given the assumed framework of the Cold War as it was coming together in 1950, some significant rearmament on the part of the United States was going to be necessary. NSC 68 made the case for doing so. That doesn't justify, for example, the enormity of the nuclear weapons program that followed, and the arms race, and the development of overkill. Again, my argument in defending the architects of the Cold War is not that they got everything right, but that they got enough right to provide the United States with a framework of basic policy that served us relatively well until the Cold War ended at the end of the 1980s. So that's a waffling defense of NSC 68, which is about the best that I can come up with.
We have a number of questions about the risk of the use of nuclear weapons if Russia is pushed to the corner. What's your view on this?
I think it's a very real risk. So during the period when Russia was building up its forces on the periphery of Ukraine, I was in the camp that said, Putin won't pull the trigger. Putin's doing this, in my estimation, Putin's doing this because he has very serious and indeed, I think, justifiable security concerns. And he wants to spook the Ukrainians, the Americans, and the Europeans into acknowledging those concerns. I persuaded myself incorrectly that Putin was a rational actor, that Putin would appreciate the risk he would be taking by going to war against Ukraine. He obviously also concluded that he had a competent army when he does not. So here we are now when the notion of nuclear weapons use has entered into the conversation in ways that I think we have not seen or heard, at least since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And I would like to say that I see evidence that Putin has gotten smarter since he recklessly undertook this war, but I don't see that evidence. No, I don't have any access to intelligence. I don't have any understanding of what kind of internal conversations are going on within the Russian elite. I don't even know if Putin has those conversations. But nonetheless, it seems to me that we have to take very seriously the possibility of nuclear weapons use. And I don't care if it is a demonstration of use of a weapon or if it involves simply so-called tactical weapons. I think that any use of nuclear weapons at this point will, first of all, obliterate the taboo that has existed since 1945, and certainly will create the possibility of unintended and unchecked escalation, leading to the ultimate tragedy. So in that regard, even though any number of critics are beating up on Biden because of his unwillingness to do things like establish a no-fly zone or provide high-performance aircraft to the Ukrainian military, I think that his prudence is appropriate and justified.
There are some questions about what could be the future of security and economic perspectives of the Ukraine once the war ends. And relatedly, what was wrong with the proposal for neutrality for Ukraine, a friendly relation with the West and friendly relations with Russia, which was there as a possibility?
Yeah, nothing was wrong with that proposal. One of my Quincy Institute colleagues, Anatol Levin, who knows a lot about Russia, was eloquent in advancing that proposition. And Anatol's analysis cited the case of Austria during the early days of the Cold War, where, despite the fact that the Cold War was going on, the United States and its allies negotiated an agreement with the Soviet Union that neutralized Austria, took it out of the game, and therefore provided for stability, democracy, peace for the Austrian people in that part of Europe for the next several decades. And Anatol's argument was something comparable to that is possible in Ukraine. It was a good argument, of course, one that didn't get much purchase in Washington. If I'm following the news correctly, President Zelensky has now said publicly that neutralization of Ukraine ought to be on the table, that is an outcome that he is willing to consider as part of some type of a package that will end the war. I would say that is a very courageous step on his part, and his courage ought to be acknowledged and rewarded. I don't think anybody is saying that alone will be the basis of bringing the war to an end, but at least it's a very promising step. It will be the greatest of tragedies if all these people are killed, hurt, injured, displaced, and yet we end up with a resolution that we could have had without any war happening in the first place.
A related question from Ray Cooper: what can the West offer that would allow Putin to walk away from the Ukraine and save face? And I'd like to add a question: why hasn't Biden picked up on Zelensky's view that Ukraine need not join NATO, and now his view that there ought to be a solution which would work for the Ukraine in a long-term sense, that with respect to its neighbor Russia?
Yeah, I think we have to acknowledge that we don't know what kind of conversations are occurring behind the curtain. So I don't know that President Biden is not willing to consider this notion of neutralization as part of a package to bring the war to an end. All we get is what we read in the New York Times. So I would like to think that it's at least possible that the United States would be open to that. But I think you used the phrase loss of face. And it does seem to me that not simply that has come to be a complicating factor, but it was a complicating factor even before hostilities began, that neither side can appear to be conceding, backing down, giving way, especially given the amount of blood that has been shed at this point. Both sides need to be able to tell their peoples, tell their own militaries, that at least half a loaf has been secured. I would think that for Putin, a commitment on the part of Ukraine, supported by the United States and NATO, that Ukraine will not, for the foreseeable future, become part of the NATO alliance, could define at least part of that half of a loaf. There lies at least the start point of a negotiation that end this thing.
We have a question from Judy Jenswald. It seems the military-industrial complex has too much money in the current state of affairs for your shift to happen. Resources would need to pivot to the issues of pestilence, climate crisis, porous border issues, surveillance society, etc. What are your thoughts for how this comes about, given the Pentagon's bipartisan support since World War II?
Well, your questioner is putting her finger on a major defect in my argument. In other words, I'm arguing and assuming that it is possible for the United States government to commit itself to a substantial redistribution of resources. Maybe we'll have a US Navy that's a little bit smaller, so we can have a US Coast Guard that is bigger. Maybe we can have a couple fewer fighter squadrons in the US Air Force, so that we can have a few more airplanes in the Forest Service to fight fires. My argument assumes that kind of reallocation of resources is possible. And I would be the first to admit that the clout wielded by the military-industrial complex does not make that a particularly likely scenario. So what needs to be done? What needs to be done, again, we peel back the onion layer by layer. What needs to happen is the rejuvenation of American politics. I am a self-defined conservative. I am not by any stretch of the imagination a Republican, but I've long believed that an effectively functioning democracy in a two-party system needs to have one party that is genuinely committed to a set of liberal or progressive principles, and another that is genuinely committed to a set of conservative principles. I'm sure this is naive on my part, but that arguing those opposing principles might provide the best way to yield enlightened policies. So if the Democratic Party were genuinely committed to progressive principles, if the Republican Party were genuinely committed to conservative principles, then it seems to me we might have a politics that could break the power of the military-industrial complex and enable the national interest to take priority over corporate interests. But that's a pipe dream, I'll admit that.
So we have a question from David Strang. He says, I hear you as an isolationist, to which I am sympathetic. Would you agree with that characterization?
No. My argument, which I have never been able to persuade anybody to agree with me, is that isolationism is a total figment of our collective imaginations. My story of the United States in terms of its engagement in the world is the United States, since its founding at the time of the Revolution, has engaged in a not consistent, but episodic and very effective strategy of opportunistic expansionism. In other words, going back to the time of Thomas Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase, when opportunities appeared for the United States to acquire territory, riches, access to markets. Successive administrations seized upon those opportunities to make our country bigger, richer, more powerful. That's what happened between 1776 and 1945. 1776, maybe more appropriately, 1781, the end of the Revolutionary War. We are a small nation consisting of 13 states huddled together on the eastern seaboard, possessing no particular power. 1945, not that long of a distance. We are far and away the richest and most powerful country in the world. How did that happen? It happened because we chose to make it happen, because we seized, the nation seized. You know, President Polk seized. President McKinley seized. President Roosevelt, second President Roosevelt, seized opportunities. That's the story of U.S. foreign policy in its broad outlines, not isolationism. We've never practiced isolationism. Even if you point to the period between, let's say, 1938 and 1941, which I think people who believe in isolationism would say that's when it reached its peak, because that's when the United States refused to join in the European effort to deal with Nazi Germany. We did refuse until December 1941. But stop for a second. Stop for a second. Why was the United States not willing to confront Adolf Hitler in 1938 or 1939? There is an argument to be made with some justification, some, that one explanation was American anti-Semitism. I accept that. I think the larger and more important explanation is in 1938, we had just 20 years before completed our first involvement in a major European war. A major departure from the American tradition of statecraft. We sent a couple million doughboys to fight on the Western Front. And what did we get in return? Well, we got 116,000 dead. That's a big number. I think the population of the country then was about 130 million. Year and a half of combat, 116,000 dead. We did not get a world made safe for democracy. We did not get a war to end all wars. So my argument, yes, in 1938, 1939, there was considerable popular opposition to intervening in another European war just 20 years later. And I would argue that that opposition was actually quite understandable. And it doesn't make any sense to call it isolationism, because we've never been an isolationist country. Long-winded argument, but that's the way I frame the evolution of America's role in the world.
Okay, we have a question. What is your view on the US-China relations? Is China a potential partner or a rival or an existential threat? I added the last one to the question from an anonymous person.
Yeah, not an existential threat. I think the first two parts of the question capture the essence of the issue, though. Yes, China is an adversary. And yes, China must be a partner. That's the dilemma. That's also one of the dilemmas that why we need fresh thinking about U.S. foreign policy. You know, there are those in and around Washington who are eager to see a Cold War begin, pitting the United States against China as if we're back in 1947. Well, 1947, we didn't need anything from the Soviet Union. They didn't make anything that we wanted. Well, here today, China makes a lot that we want, and we need the commercial relationship between our two countries. So we must collaborate in terms of commercial matters. And there is also, to my mind, the overarchingly important issue of the climate crisis. People disagree. I'm in the camp that says the climate crisis is the existential threat of the 21st century. That's what we have to fix, to the extent that it's fixable. And there is no fixing it. There is no addressing it effectively unless the United States and the People's Republic of China find a way to collaborate in dealing with it. That is a strategic priority of great importance. So yeah, there's an adversarial relationship here. I think we Americans have a very difficult time dealing with the prospect of somebody else being richer than we are. You know, we are accustomed to thinking of ourselves as being the richest country on the planet. That is also related to our conception of freedom, economic primacy. Well, it's disappearing. And so we're very difficult time dealing with that. But the answer to the question is, yeah, it's an adversarial relationship which must include elements of collaboration, or we're all doomed.
Okay, related to this, the question of US-China relations is one about the weaponization of the SWIFT system and the US dollar, from John Mock. Should the US dollar remain the world's dominant reserve currency and preferred medium for international transaction?
I'm not an economist. I hope it will. I mean, it seems to me the fact that the dollar is the reserve currency of the entire planet pays enormous dividends, helps to prop up our global position. I'm not enough of I don't know enough about economics to even venture whether or not that is sustainable. And I read articles that tell me, oh yeah, it is, not to worry. But when I consider the mushrooming size of the American national debt, which I think is now somewhere in the vicinity of $30 trillion, when I think about the fiscal mismanagement of the federal government, which now routinely has multi-trillion-dollar deficits from one year to the next, as somebody who's not an economist, I have to wonder if our own reckless behavior will not ultimately create opportunities for some other currency or cryptocurrency to displace the dollar. Hope it won't happen. Don't know if it will, but that's all I know. Not much, really.
Let's see, we have a question. Do you have any suggestions for how the Ukraine war can be ended? From Hilton Mac.
Yeah, I think step number one has to be to defer to President Zelensky. It's his country that's taken a beating. He, more than anybody else, is sensitive to Ukraine's prospects for future security. And therefore, what he decides is acceptable, I think we should endorse. In other words, if Zelensky decides that the breakaway provinces of the Donbass are gone for good, that they will exist in some kind of semi-autonomous state, but basically become Russian protectorates. If he's good enough at that, we should be good enough at that. If this ends up making permanent Russian control of the Crimea, if Zelensky's okay with that, we should be okay with that. So I think, again, I think that the bottom line is, in trying to do everything we can to help this war come to an end, deferring to Zelensky is an important principle.
We have a question from John Mostow. Some seem to see Putin as an evil villain, and our situation regarding Ukraine as comparable to 1938-39 with regard to Hitler. Thus, to give in to Putin in any way is the equivalent of appeasement. Can you respond to this view?
Well, in 1938, 1939, we didn't know it yet, but Hitler had the best army in the world. And we learned that in 1939 in Poland, in 1940 in France. Hitler had the best army in the world. Putin doesn't have the best army in the world. In fact, Putin has a remarkably incompetent army. And so, once again, there's this reflexive inclination in American discourse to want to frame crises as a return to the late 1930s. I think we should be very wary of doing that. I would argue that perhaps if we're looking for historical comparisons, that a better one probably would be 1914. When that war began, it was clear in the West, it was even clear in the minds of people like Woodrow Wilson. It was clear that the Germans had caused the war, that the war began with an act of German aggression. They were the bad guys. And that concept, of course, continued to the end of the war in 1918. And the negotiation of in the Paris Peace Conference, which concluded that one nation should bear the guilt for the war, for the catastrophe that occurred, and that was Germany. This was a greatly oversimplified historical judgment, and quite frankly, contributed appreciably then to another war 20 years later. The question of responsibility for the war of 1914, 1918 has been a source of great contention by generations of historians, European historians, American historians, historians from all the belligerent nations. And those historians have reached a variety of conclusions, none of which let Germany off the hook. But I think most conclusions, here we are more than 100 years later, is that the war of 1914 cannot be assigned simply to one country. There's no one government, no one decision maker who can be blamed. It was a convergence of circumstances informed by folly that led to this catastrophe. And I think once we get past the ongoing war and we're able to reflect on its origins with some dispassion, it's my guess that we'll reach some similar conclusions. There's no question that Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine didn't invade Russia. But I think we'll come to more nuanced conclusions about the origins of the war, which, as was the case in 1914, will lead us to the conclusion that there are no innocent parties in understanding this horrible event.
Well, we're running out of time. Let me ask a question. There is a partition theory that argues that Putin's objective is not to conquer and take off Ukraine in this war that he probably regrets starting. But now that it's being fought, that his aim is to take the Russian part of Ukraine and the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine, which is the east and the south, and partition this and leave Ukraine with the rest of the country and that this would provide a buffer. And even if Ukraine were hostile, there would be a buffer. And that this was a territory that for 200 years was called the New Russia, Novo Russia. Catherine the Great founded Odessa. And so it has historic value and meaning to Russia. And that if this were to be proposed, it would be one which would concede a great deal to Russia in fighting this war. What's your view on this? It is also consistent with Colonel McGregor's assessment that the Russian army is doing far better than the New York Times reports, that they have secured the valuable land access to Crimea, and they are focusing on the eastern part of Ukraine, and that the war isn't going so badly for Putin in that view, from McGregor, who's a much decorated American colonel.
I have seen little evidence to support McGregor's hypothesis. But let's face it, all of us in making judgments about how this war is going are making those judgments based on limited evidence and evidence that may well be tainted by the perspective of the source of that evidence. But I think he's wrong. I cannot imagine that Putin intended this war to go on as long as it has, or that he imagined that the Russian army would sustain the losses that it has. Again, to emphasize, we're not certain about what those losses are, but the reports seem to suggest that they are extraordinary, already surpassing what the Red Army sustained during its nearly decade-long occupation of Afghanistan back in the 1980s. So I'm simply not, I am not buying the argument that this is going according to the Russian plan. And I think as a concluding point, we have to acknowledge the difficulty of forecasting how any war is going to end, militarily, I mean, the outcome. The Russians have performed poorly, the Ukrainians have performed gallantly. That does not mean that when this war ends, it does not preclude the possibility that when the war ends, the Russian army isn't going to be occupying Kyiv. We simply have to observe, and we'll wait and see.
Right. Certainly, the analogy of Afghanistan comes to mind, but what about the World War II and the Red Army defense of Kiev, and taken by surprise by Hitler's Operation Barbarossa, and the Red Army took a huge punishment in defending Kiev, and they were encircled and defeated, and they took a huge punishment in the defense of Sebastopol, and they were defeated, and was their Alamo. And so it was defeated, but then they regrouped, and then they moved to defend, encircled Stalingrad, and then they pushed on from there to Berlin. So it seems as though, yes, the initial hope that it would be a quick war was dashed, and they have fought poorly, and they've suffered huge relative casualty. But what's to keep Russia, which is so much more, the economy is so much larger than Ukraine, and from regrouping as the Red Army regrouped, to continue and push for this war until they win?
a plausible scenario. Here's what argues against it. In a sense, what argues against it is Stalin. Putin ain't no Stalin. There was a genius about the way that Stalin framed the war as a great patriotic war, one in which I think it's fair to say he persuaded the Russian people to become deeply invested. They were fighting for their homeland. That's not the case today. Again, according to press reports, it doesn't appear that Russian soldiers have much of any kind of an understanding about what they're fighting for. Putin has made this argument that they're fighting against fascism, which of course would recall the war of 1941, 1945. But it doesn't appear to me that that has had any particular resonance. So that'd be the first point. The second point, I think, relates to Russian military leadership. And I'm not an expert on the war on the Eastern Front, but it does appear that after the early battles, when the Red Army performed poorly, that there was a further purge of senior Russian military leadership. And Stalin was able to install in positions of authority some great generals who were able to turn the tide on the Wehrmacht and ultimately win the war. They were ruthless, but they were great generals. I don't even think we know the name of the individual who is commanding Russian forces in this war. I can tell you that if I were Putin, I would have fired that guy long ago. Because if there is going to, if the Russians are going to turn this thing around, one of the many things that they need to do is to install in senior positions of the Russian army people who can get the job done, who will be not only ruthless, because they'll have to be ruthless, but also skillful in being able to take advantage of the lead that the Russians have in terms of numbers, in terms of weapon systems. So I think those are the two issues in terms, what's the motivation for a Russian soldier to go die in Ukraine? I don't know that there's much of one. And where is the Russian senior military leadership that's going to take advantage of Russia's quantitative advantages?
Well, we have just enough time for you to sum up this wonderful lecture that helped us to better understand the need to change American national security priority.
Well, I don't know if I'm ready to sum up, except to say the following, which really was implicit, I think, in the talk, is that it will be a great tragedy if the war in Ukraine hijacks or preempts efforts to rethink US national security policy. Because the old ways that worked decently in the post-war era, that is to say during the Cold War, simply are now no longer pertinent. And unfortunately, there is some evidence that the Ukraine war creates among important parts of American society a conviction that we can sort of just return to the good old days, put that in quotes, the good old days of the Cold War. I think that would be a huge mistake.
Well, that's a good note to end the lecture, and it was a great lecture, and thank you so much for the improvised part of it, which is to respond to the question of an event that you did not anticipate would happen so soon after you wrote your original lecture. We learned a great deal, and thank you very, very much. Andrew Bacevich.
Thanks for including me. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.